So the AfD is a strange party, and in some ways it's quite different from the other far-right parties that have been, getting stronger across Europe during the last decade. And that starts with the origins of the AfD. It starts out not as a far-right party at all. In 2013, when it's created, it's a party of liberal economics professors, and it's created very much in response to Angela Merkel's response to the euro crisis.
The party's main policy is to eliminate the euro and return to a national currency and budget.
Even the name, Alternative for Germany, is an explicit response to her statement that there's no alternative to bailing out Greece. And so it really wasn't a far-right party originally. It then reinvents itself after the refugee crisis, or rather during the refugee crisis in 2015, as an anti-immigrant, anti-Islam party.
Germany say to many refugees, welcome.
People in Syria should be getting a chance to live there on their own.
That is the problem, that the refugees come.
And then gets into the Bundestag for the first time in 2017, in other words, 2 years after the refugee crisis. But the extraordinary thing about the AfD is how it's been becoming more radical over time. So even if you compare the AfD of today with the AfD of 2015 or 2017, this is now a much, much more extreme party. And this is, again, one of the things that sets it apart from other far-right parties in Europe, many of which, if we take, say, Giorgia Meloni in Italy as being the paradigmatic case, or even Marine Le Pen in France, at least in some ways, they've been becoming more moderate or sort of pretending to become more moderate. The AfD has been moving in the opposite direction and becoming more extreme over time. It's one of the puzzles, actually, about the AfD is how they're able to do this. And I think part of what's now happening is we're having to reassess a lot of what we thought about Germany, because for a long time people thought that Germany was a kind of an exception in Europe. It was somehow immune to the rise of the far right because of its history and so on. But now you have this party that's much more extreme than other far right parties in Europe and is doing really well. It's forcing us to slightly rethink what we thought we knew about Germany. And I think it turns out that, to put it very, very bluntly, Germany turns out to be a much more racist country than a lot of people thought it was. This is a distinction in political science as well between radical right parties, sometimes called populist parties, and extreme right parties. The rough distinction is that, radical right parties, may have very extreme positions on questions like identity and immigration and Islam or other issues, but they're essentially accepting the democratic rules of the game. Whereas an extreme right party is one that, would be challenging those, trying to undermine liberal democracy, essentially. In Germany, that's not just a sort of political science distinction, it's an important legal distinction, because the extreme right parties are those which are deemed to be rejecting the German constitution and, as I say, implicitly liberal democracy. And so then what happens is that if you're suspected of doing that, the German Domestic Intelligence Service, which is actually called the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, will monitor you. At the end of that process, you can potentially be banned by the German Supreme Court. And what's been happening with the AfD is it's been sort of going through those steps. What happens is that initially the Domestic Intelligence Agency monitors the regional branches of the AfD, and it's already identified 3 of those branches in the east of Germany as being extreme right, and the youth wing of the party as well. And it suspects several other branches and the party as a whole of being extreme right. It hasn't yet reached the conclusion that it definitively is extreme right. We've never quite been in this position before in the history of the Federal Republic, where there's been a party that has been so successful and is on that cusp of being identified as being, a threat to the Federal Republic and its constitution. There have been other far-right parties in the history of the Federal Republic. None of them has done as well electorally as the AfD. There've also been, extreme right neo-Nazi movements and so on. But as I say, they haven't had the political kind of power that the AfD have had. So this is really kind of unprecedented in the history of the Federal Republic.
Und wenn ich auf die letzten 1-2 Wochen zurückblicke, es tut sich ja immer sehr viel in der Republik.
It's not just unlikely that they'll be in government, it's almost certain that they won't be in government, because the whole strategy of the other parties, the mainstream parties, at least at a national level, is to exclude them from the coalition that will be formed after the election. And so what this means in practice is that the stronger the AfD become, essentially the more the other mainstream parties for essentially parties that could be in a coalition, the more they have to join forces in order to form any kind of stable government. So what the rise of the AfD is already doing is making the German political system more and more dysfunctional. And what happens, and in a way, this is precisely the story of the government that just collapsed at the end of last year, leading to this election, is that the mainstream parties join forces to form a coalition, but that coalition becomes almost quite incoherent because it includes parties from across the political system, and it can't really do anything. And then it breaks down. And this is exactly what has happened now with the Scholz government. Even though the AfD have got no chance of being in the next German government, what they're doing is indirectly really reshaping the agenda of German politics, especially around immigration. All the way going back to the refugee crisis, frankly, but especially in the last few years, the Christian Democrats and even the Social Democrats have essentially been sort of chasing the AfD agenda on immigration, promising to enact tougher and tougher measures to stop immigration, to make deportation easier, and so on. The Social Democrats have also kind of, moved in this direction on immigration. In particular, Olaf Scholz in 2023 famously appeared on the front cover of the Spiegel magazine with this declaration: we have to start deporting people on a grand scale, very much trying to chase AfD voters or win back AfD voters. And so far it seems as if that's not working. If anything, it may be strengthening the AfD. But as I say, in the meantime, what's happening is that even though the AfD have no chance of being in government, German politics is being reshaped around their agenda.